Good afternoon, children. Thanks for bearing with us there through the little bit of technical glitches right at the end. We tested this the other day and it worked flawlessly, and then of course we show up today and it doesn't work exactly how we want. That's just how it works. But I know why you guys are all here today. We're here to talk to the one and only Mr. Andrew Scheps. How you doing today, Andrew?
Excellent, thanks. Hey, everybody.
Nice. So for those of you who don't know, somehow Andrew has worked with just about everybody, every type of genre that you can imagine. He's worked with Adele, Red Hot Chili Peppers, Metallica, Beyonce, Green Day, U2, Lana Del Rey, Black Sabbath, Zach Brown Band, and I mean that list just keeps on going. Andrew, do you have a favorite out of all of them?
Yeah, right. uh, no, I mean, there's some, obviously, I love a lot of them. I would say that in terms of the bigger stuff, the Chili Peppers was one of the first times I got to work with a band that I'd been a fan of forever. And the same with Audioslave. I'd been, obviously, Rage and Soundgarden fans forever and working on that record. And then some of the tiny little indie stuff I do for my label, I love because I'm a lot more involved. But no, man, I'm just super lucky.
Yeah, that's awesome. So we have hundreds of questions for you today. So we're not gonna have time to get everybody's questions, but I'm gonna do as many of them as I possibly can. And the cool part is that you've already done lots of tutorials with us. So a lot of these answers, to some of the questions I was seeing, you've answered in your tutorials. But actually, what we're going to do today is I prepared two exclusive excerpts from your latest tutorial with us, which was you breaking down your mix for Green Day, Bang Bang, which was an epic video, man. That was super cool. I grew up with Green Day, so getting to hear isolated bits out of Green Day and hear what you did to it, that was awesome. So cool.
Thanks.
So we're gonna close up today's broadcast with an excerpt, I believe, of the bass and toms, and kind of shown a little bit of what's in that video. Obviously, there's a lot more in the whole video, and then there's also your template video, which has been going nuts. There's just people are, the comments and the feedback from that one, and also the amount of people using and adapting your template is really awesome to see.
Great, great. And I'll
Yeah.
try to keep the answers short because I can talk forever. So I'll try and keep it short so we can get to a lot of them.
Awesome. So yeah, let's dive right in. By the way, if you guys are watching this, obviously you're watching online. We would definitely appreciate if you share it. Share it on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. Make sure if you tag Puremix at Puremix Online for both Twitter and Instagram, and on Facebook, just share it with all of your friends. We're gonna leave the replay of this Q&A up for a couple of weeks, so you'll be able to come back and rewatch, re-see the answers, or share it with your friends who missed it live. But if you're here live, we'll also be checking in on the live chat, as well as all the questions that we got ahead of time. So let's dive straight into the first question, which, Chris Brady wanted to know, what were some of your early influences in terms of mixing?
Hi, Chris. How's it going? Oh God, again, I have to keep this quick. In terms of mixing, I don't know because I didn't really start out to be a mixer, so I wasn't paying a huge amount of attention to just that. But I mean, obviously, for straight up mixers, I mean, Bob Clearmountain, definitely. But it was more some of the people who wrapped it inside their production, like Daniel Lenoir and Brian Eno and all the records they made either together or apart. And I love just the way those records are balanced. Al Schmidt, obviously, as a balancer, is impeccable. But I don't know if I think of any later on. See, I made the mistake again of telling Ben I didn't want the questions first. So I have no idea what's coming because I thought, well, that's good. But for questions like this, I should have thought about it. So I have no idea. And there are a million of them. So I'll think of some later, I'm sure.
Awesome. So what about, next question is, how long did it take you to go from taking mixing seriously to being a full-fledged professional mixing engineer?
Well, again, I don't know because I didn't start out even thinking about mixing as a separate thing. I just wanted to make records, and came up as an engineer. And I always thought like I would eventually, if I was lucky, I'd be producing full time. But it turns out that now I'm mixing probably 85% of the time with production not not nearly as much as I thought it would be. So, I mean, I guess, when did I start taking mixing seriously? Maybe 99 Problems or a little bit before that, something like that. And I still always feel like the next gig is not guaranteed. I mean, I've been really lucky the last couple of years that it's been pretty constant, but I'll still have, month-long periods, 3-month-long periods where there's just nothing going on. So in terms of like the career thing, it's obviously I've done really well and I'm really lucky with a lot of the stuff I've been able to do, but it's an ongoing process. You're never kind of set. And I think advice for people starting out is never to think like, well, I just need that one gig and then it'll all fall into place. It won't. Every gig helps, but like when you're talking about how diverse my discography is, the gigs I get now come from things in the discography usually, and sometimes it's stuff that has nothing to do with what they want me to mix. And I'm always really surprised. So I actually make a point of asking, like, well, hey, so why did you think of me for this? And sometimes it's completely off the wall what they're thinking of. So just keep at it. And, I don't know. I don't have anything specific for that one, though.
So there's another question right here of like, if you were just starting your mixer career today, what advice would you give people to build their work and their reputation?
Well, this is a bit of advice I've given before, and this goes not just for mixing, but for engineering and also for producing, is find musicians, artists, and bands who are at the same spot in their career as you are in yours. Don't like, man, I should make the next U2 record because then I'll learn a lot. Like, no, find your neighborhood band that you think is going to be the next U2 and do an EP with them and do a couple of songs in their living room or whatever. And that way you get to learn in a place where you're allowed to make mistakes and nobody is expecting things that you're not really ready for, but you'll also be really appreciated and you'll get a lot of great practice. And man, there are millions of bands that want help doing stuff. And if they can come up with $50 and lunch, then you're all set.
That's all they need, right? Just lunch,
Yeah.
and Andrew will mix the record, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Do you are you using an assistant these days, or what kind of
No,
tasks?
I'm
No.
I'm completely on my own now. I mean, there's a guy, Justin Herget in LA, who helps me out, but he's gotten super busy on his own mixing. So he doesn't really have time most of the time when I like think of something like, ooh, it'd be cool if he could print mixes on this. So no, I kind of do everything myself. And it used to feel like, well, if I could hand off the session prep, that would be good. The only thing I wouldn't mind handing off at this point is just printing because it takes so long.
Hmm.
But there are always like weird little decisions you have to make while you're printing different versions of mixes too. Like, oh, do these weird distorted vocals, or is that an instrument or is that a vocal? And so, yeah, I just do everything myself. It's bizarre, but it works.
Well, he's actually segued right into another question that I got a bunch was, how do you handle stems and alternate mixes? With your mixing template, you're using so much parallel processing and effects and
Yeah,
everything. So how does that
everything
work?
everything has to be printed separately. I mean, I can't. Fortunately, I can bounce off lines, so it'll go usually 2 times real time because
Hmm.
with all the native stuff going on, and I think UAD slows that down quite a bit because it buffers to and from their hardware. So I'm lucky if I get like 2.2 times real time. But yeah, it's all got to be done in real time. And stems, basic stems like drums, guitars, maybe you split the guitars up into 2 groups, something like that. I'll just deliver that as part of the mixing because everybody wants it, even though it's never useful for anything. And because all the stuff is shared parallel, they don't add up to the mix anyway. But if the bass player needs to learn a part or whatever, I'd much rather get a specific list of samples they need for live or something like that and spend time doing useful things. But then if they want more split up stems, then they've got to pay some hourly fee. And that's like the kind of stuff that's perfect for Justin because it's never
Hmm.
that timely. And I can say, look, you pay this guy so much an hour. He's got a duplicate set up in terms of plugins to me. And he can just open the sessions and print stuff. So that works pretty well. But you just have to deliver those things now. I'd love to say, nope, I deliver a main mix and that's it. But no way. That doesn't work.
Yeah, not what everybody's looking for. So Bruno was asking, what's your decision process for knowing that you've reached quote unquote the mix?
Well, I mean, I don't ever think on my own that I've reached the mix. But what I have to do is get to the point where I'm ready to send the mix to the artist for the first time. That's when I'm making a decision. After it goes to the artist and I'm getting mix notes, it's up to them to decide when we're done. And that's a whole nother thing, which probably someone's asking about later on, so I won't go into it too much. Basically, I have to be able to listen to it and not think that there's anything that I should change. Not necessarily that could be better, because everything could always be better or different or whatever. There are a million different ways to do it, but I just keep working on it until I feel like, no, that's done. Like I've addressed all the stuff that I kind of made a list of in my head when I started working, and then I've taken care of all the details that have come up along the way, and now I feel like I'm excited for the artist to hear it. And I'm still super insecure, and I hate sending that mix. I hate it. But you do get to the point where like I could work on this for another 4 days and I wouldn't actually change anything. And so for me, fortunately, I'm pretty good at not going off into the weeds on stuff. So I know, relatively early when it's to the stage where I should send it off. And sometimes it isn't that I think it's done, but I think I've gotten to the point where I need input, because they're like two competing things in the chorus, and I've built it one way, but they need to decide whether it has to be another way. So I don't necessarily think like it could just be done, but it's definitely some version of that.
So, do you also like take the mix and reference it in the car or on different speakers, headphones? Does that weigh into your process at all?
No. Nope.
Nope, not at all.
I mix where I mix, and when the mix is done where I mix, then the mix is done. No, I never take stuff out anymore. But that's just me, and it's just the way I work, and I'm weird, and I'm not advocating that.
Yeah. Did you used to?
Nope. Nope. It's more, I mean, I used to when I didn't really have my monitoring situation together. Like I hadn't found the tannoys yet. I was still like back and forth to NS10s, but then once I got that together, it just, I know what that's supposed to sound like. So the only variable is the mix I'm working on. And that to me is really important. If the variable is 5 different listening environments, then which one do you trust? I mean, if you kind of have a problem with this thing, with a vocal in the car, but the low end feels great, but then in the studio, the low end feels like it's too light, then like, well, okay, who's right there? So I think I would just find that super confusing. But there are times when I'll get mix notes, and then when I go back and listen, or I listen somewhere else, it's like, oh, wow, how did I miss that? But you might get over that listening in lots of different places, but most of the time that doesn't happen, and I just feel like it would be confusing and take up a lot of time.
Yeah. So switching gears here a little bit, we had a lot of questions about gain staging, gain structure, working with an internal mixer. What are some of the fundamentals about gain stage inside the box that you think people need to know about?
Well, I mean, the main thing is you've got to understand what floating point architecture is. But so what that means is you cannot clip internally in Pro Tools. It's technically impossible. And if the plugins you're using are written properly, it's impossible to clip unless you're using something like a limiter or something that obviously has distortion built in, that kind of clipping. But otherwise, what will happen is what will come out and go to the speakers might be clipped because the waveform is too big when you try to shove it through the D to A. But if you turn it down with a master fader all the way at the very end of the mix bus, it'll recover the waveform because it keeps track of how much it's overshooting. Now that's good because you can build a mix that can all be a little bit too loud, but you love the way it feels, and then you can just bring it down at the very end and you'll recover some peaks and stuff like that. But obviously, as you're going through dynamics processing, anything that has a threshold, well, if you change how much level is going into those things, then it's going to change what it sounds like. So you just need to understand your signal flow. You don't actually have to worry about gain staging as much anymore because you can reach inside the Pro Tools mixer, and I'm sure at this point all of the DAWs are floating point. So you can reach inside with master faders or auxes or whatever and turn things down later and keep the relationships the same. So it's a very technical thing, doing audio, and it was the same back when it was just electronics and physics and not computers, but it's still very technical, and you need to know what things are actually doing so you know where to attack a problem when you have a gain problem.
And how do you learn that? How do you learn where there's actually a problem and when there's not? Because
Just,
there's
just
there's
when
some
it sounds
plugins that
bad.
have sweet spots, and then there's some plugins that are just the same no matter where you hit them.
Yeah, I mean, well, obviously anything that does dynamics or distortion, it has a threshold, right? A clipper
Yeah.
has a threshold, and all dynamics have a threshold, and there's even a knob called threshold on most of them. So that's actually really easy, and an EQ shouldn't sound any different no matter how hard you hit it. You could turn it up 60 dB on the way into an EQ, then EQ the crap out of it. It's going to sound like a square wave. Turn it down 60 dB, and if everything is written properly in terms of the software, it's going to sound just like you didn't do the gain before and after. It'll be exactly the same. So you just have to understand what's working. Now, for me, like while I'm mixing, how do I know when my mix is too loud? Because it sounds bad. Like I know when I'm hitting a compressor too hard because it just doesn't sound right to me. So that sweet spot isn't, I couldn't tell you what level is going in, but I know for sure that I'm either not getting the benefit or I'm getting the mix destroyed. And there's usually only a 2 or 3 dB range of what sounds good to me. And you just get used to your tools. It's part of why having a template is important for me. I'm not trying to find which bus compressor to use each time. I really
Yeah.
know the stuff I'm using.
And you're doing all that by ear, right? And not really looking at the meters or opening up, a plugin and seeing how much is my rear bus going down. You're just judging
No,
by
no,
how it
no.
sounds, right?
Yeah. The only meters I'll ever even look at are on a 33609 plugin that's on my mix bus. It's the first thing on there. But it's more just to confirm what I'm hearing, because usually I know exactly when that thing isn't right.
Hmm.
And then just by listening, I use a master fader and get the level where I think it should be. And then sometimes I'll go look at the meters just to double check that I'm not crazy. Because it could be something other than that compressor that's causing what I'm hearing. But that's how I'll double check that, okay, now I am in the right range in my mix bus. But yeah, it's always by ear.
Yeah. So we also got a lot of questions about metal mixing, and apparently, something that there isn't enough info out there about doing rock and metal and heavier sounding music. First question always with that genre is guitars. And
Well,
Dominic
hold
wrote
on a
in.
second. Hold
Uh-huh.
on.
What do you got?
I'll show you what I got.
Metal music manual. That's all you need.
That's
So
all you
just
need.
buy that book.
I was interviewed for this. It's by this guy, Mark Minette. I'm assuming that's how you pronounce his name. And a ton of other people who do way more metal than me
Hmm.
were interviewed. I mean, I mix metal like I mix rock. I don't really differentiate. So the guys who do like the serious speed metal stuff, Pantera style and things like that, there's a lot of side chaining going on. There's a huge amount of side chaining within the drums and then also with the guitars and things just to make room for every single transient and stuff like that to get through. And I don't do any of that. So we can go back to like the specific questions that you've got, but I would highly recommend checking out this book. It's really good. They interviewed a lot of people. I mean, real quickly, Ross Robinson, Frederick Nordstrom, Matt Hyde, Logan Mader, Andy Sneat, Jens Bergen, Daniel Bergenstrad, and Nick Raskulenix did like major contributions to this book.
Yeah.
So it's awesome. There are a lot of great techniques in there. I've learned a lot not reading my own interviews in there. Okay, so
You don't learn from
what
yourself?
were no, hell no. What were the specific questions, though? And I'll see if I can help.
Yeah. What are your thoughts on approaching doubling rock guitars? How do you record it? How do you mix it?
I love the sound of doubled rhythm guitars, and there are two reasons. One is it just makes the mix wide.
Yeah.
Two, well, okay, I don't know how many reasons I said there'd be. There are going to be a bunch. Two, you get different strumming on both sides, and it gives you this really great motion without being distracting because they're both playing the same part, but there'll be slightly different dynamics within. But most importantly, it means that you're not trying to get a really important instrument to work in the middle of the mix. It's out on the sides. And you can actually take rhythm guitars if you really want to go crazy and put them into some sort of like MS Matrix and turn down the middle a little bit, and that'll leave a lot more room for kick, bass, but more importantly, vocal and cymbals, which are in the same range in snare. But they'll still be really heavy on the sides. The other thing is try not to have them too distorted. The cleaner they are, the more definition there'll be and the more tone there'll be and the less fizz. And the fizz is where you're going to start fighting with cymbals. And that's going to be difficult to overcome because you just won't be able to hear what's going on, and the mix will turn into a mess up there. So those are the two main things. I'm a big fan of double guitars, but definitely don't double just by doing one performance on two cabinets. If you love the two cabinets, combine them to make one guitar track and just bounce them together and have a single track, and then get a second performance, and definitely double it with performance, not with delay or with cabinets or reamping or anything.
So what happens when you get a record that has 16 tracks of guitar? So like two performances, a DI, three microphones, and just a huge stack of guitars.
Yeah, well,
what do you do?
For each performance, I just decide, well, is this a mono thing or a stereo thing, and then I'll bounce it. And 90% of the time, I leave the balance exactly how it is in the session when I get it, because that's how everybody's been listening to it since they recorded the guitar. And it's what the singer sang to, because invariably the vocal was done after the guitars. So that is the guitar tone. Yeah. And I will literally just bounce all that so that it's manageable for me while I'm mixing, because it's not for me to second guess that, unless when I listen to it, I think there's a problem that I can fix by rebalancing. But I just treat it as like someone just put off the actual engineering. They just didn't bother to bounce it.
Yeah.
You know, but that's okay. You know, I guess it's better to have the option later, but those options are things that need to be decided by the band and the guitar player and the producer, not by me. I shouldn't be rebalancing guitar microphones in my mind.
Yeah. So then, Boss was asking, when you're mixing heavy metal, are there some like standard compression or EQ moves that you typically make as like a starting point?
No, I mean there's. If you see that template video, you'll see that there are a lot of tools that are in there, and a lot of them get used in similar ways on different mixes. But there's nothing that's genre specific that I do on anything. I have exactly one template, and it was the same template I used on Beyonce and First Aid Kit and Metallica and Black Sabbath. Now, to be fair, Metallica and Sabbath were actually mixed on a console, but my template is based on what was going on in the console anyway, and some of those tools were already in place. So the concepts were always exactly the same, and 99 Problems had exactly the same approach as all the rest of it. Everything to me is a rock track, because that's just I don't know. That's in my mind, everything is a rock track. So yeah. The tools are the same. They will get used differently, but that's always just an on-the-fly, in-the-moment thing that I couldn't even tell you what I'm doing differently, but I am.
Oh, that's really cool. So thinking again, like if everything is always a rock track, we had a question come in from Liam who was wondering, how do you get John Frusciante's guitars to sit so well in the mix when he has all these like modulation and effects? He's noticing with his mixes that a lot of guitars, especially when they have the effects on them, they start sounding like unfocused and just muddy in a mix. So how do you get the best of both worlds? All the effects on the guitar, but also clarity in the mix.
Well, I mean, the easy answer is to have John Frusciante play all your guitar parts, which is just me being kind of a dick. So we'll come back from that. One of the things is listen to everything that's going on in those mixes that isn't the guitars and hear how much space there is. The drums are really well defined. Anthony's vocals super defined. I mean, we're talking about the Chili Peppers stuff now. I mean, John's solo stuff is a different story. I won't even bother speaking to that because it's different. And every song he's ever done as a solo artist is so different from every other one. It doesn't make as much sense. But like the bass is super well defined. So things not necessarily are compartmentalized or are small, but there's a lot of space in the drums. The drums aren't distorted and full on. There's a lot of detail. They can still hear all of the dynamics in the hi-hat work that Chad does. So that leaves a lot of room for the guitars. And John's just a master. And Josh Klinghoffer after him on the Chili Peppers stuff, they're masters at building guitar arrangements. So they're not taking a regular guitar part and then saying like, oh, let me put a bunch of effects on it, whatever. The effects are part of the part. So it's, you couldn't take the effects off and have a more defined version of that part. It just wouldn't even work anymore. And the whole guitar arrangement is built as a whole. It's not like I'm going to do the guitars the song needs and now I'm going to see like what else I can come up with. It's all very much built as an arrangement. And that's what will help. The other thing is, I think, and this goes for every single instrument in the mix, people spend way too much time trying to get every little thing to sound good. Don't. Some of those guitar tones are nothing but honky mid-range, and on their own they would sound terrible, but sitting on top of the bass and the rhythm guitar or the acoustic guitar or whatever it is, that's all they need to be, and it sounds perfect. And they borrow frequencies from other instruments. They borrow low end from the acoustic and the bass or the kick drum or whatever. They borrow top end from the cymbals, so they don't need it. And that makes things much smaller, much easier to move around, and also mess with panning. Because it often, you'll think arrangement-wise it makes sense to have this thing opposite that thing, but then it turns out you can actually hear both of them easier when they're on top of each other. Like, who knows why, but mess with that. It's always something worth messing with.
Well, and I mean, and the best advice you just gave there, though, is that the best mix comes from the best arrangement. And starting the mix with how the song is structured and how the parts are arranged, like, that's such a key insight right there.
Yeah, and I think like on the Green Day video, I know there are a couple comments about how I didn't like do that much, and so why wasn't there more digging in? And it was because I was lucky enough to get an amazingly arranged and performed song. So like if I did more than that, I would just screw it up. But yes, the arrangement is king. When you're having trouble mixing a song, see if you can do something to the arrangement, even if it's just like muting a couple of percussion parts here and there or whatever. But that will go a long way towards making a mix easy.
Yeah. And for all the people that have been joining us since the beginning, we're here with Andrew Scheps, and he was just talking about his Green Day tutorial, which came out about a month ago. We're going to actually have a few exclusive clips from that tutorial at the end of this interview, so make sure you guys stick around till the end. But now, Andrew, I really want to get into some specifics here. We have tons of questions about EQ, compression, plugins, reverbs. So let's dip our toe in a little bit here. And
okay, and we'll do it kind of batterbox style. So I'll try and go super short on these answers.
Great. This one should be an easy one for you. What are your thoughts on high passing low frequencies? Do you have set points that you look for? How do you treat high passing?
You just do it. When I was mixing on a console, I had set frequencies, so that's what I used. I use that Scheps 73 that I did with Waves all the time, because why would you develop a plugin and not use it? I mean, I made it how I like it, so that has the same, slightly different frequencies, but the same kind of set frequency thing. Or I'll use EQ3, just, the stock Pro Tools one, and high pass. But it's always to fix problems. I don't do it just by default. It's like, oh, that thing has too much low end, let me clean it up.
Yeah. Nice. So next question comes from Alwyn. He's wondering, a lot of people talk about subtractive EQ and, kind of notching things out and, tailoring the signal. What about additive EQ? How do you know when and why you would reach for boosting things as opposed to taking away?
Well, I mean, look, the obvious way to think about it is you are taking away things you don't like, and you want a fully parametric, like super precise EQ, so you're getting rid of what you think is a problem without messing up the rest of it. And then something like a Neve, especially, is a very broad musical EQ. I never take away with a Neve EQ. I'm only boosting because it's musical and it's broad, and it's more about the kind of vibe of the instrument in terms of the tone. It's like, oh, the piano has this really nice thing going on around 3.5K. If you do that with a tight band on a parametric, it can start ringing and getting nasal or whatever. You do it with a nice wide Neve style, or even API to some extent, and what you get is a broader curve, and it's more like, oh, the feeling has opened up in that frequency range. So both types of EQ I use all the time. And I take stuff out of guitars, vocals, cymbals, any sort of annoying mid-range frequencies. They're gone, because then you've opened up all of that for intelligibility in the vocal and top of the snare and that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. And do you also do the same thing for more on the low end as well? Is it just the mid-range that you're doing those tricks on?
No, there's a lot of stuff like between 2 and 300 where stuff just feels woofy. It just starts like, ugh. And I'll clear that out. Yeah, and that will normally be more on a parametric EQ though. I won't
Hmm.
tighten it up too much, but yeah, somewhere between 200 and 300 usually, like on acoustic guitars or background vocals or that kind of thing. You can really open up a ton of space by just dipping that out. And even just a couple of dB can make a huge difference.
Yeah, totally. So, you know, bunch of these questions we're looking for like go-to frequencies, and I know that kind of mixes into like the go-to EQs, right? You mentioned you like to use the Scheps 73. So specifically, Jonathan here was asking about snare drums. What are kind of your go-to frequencies for tweaking the EQ on a snare drum?
Well, I mean, my go-tos are what is on a Neve,
Yeah.
33609 or a 1073. So the high shelf, absolutely. The top mid-range frequency. And on the Shep 73, there's actually a 10K in the mid-range, but that's not a standard one. So it's usually 7.2. So
Hmm.
7.2K bell, the 10K shelf, and then 220 is the highest low shelf that there is on the Neve. That tends to be right where the body of the snare is. And those EQs are so broad and so musical, it doesn't matter if it's exactly the right frequency. It's close enough. So I use those three bands of the EQ as they are. And then if I need to, I'll pop the high pass filter in as well, but usually don't need to. Unless it's recorded kind of strangely, I just go ahead and leave the low end alone.
So something else that came a question from Rob here is how do you keep the clarity, punch, and warmth in a mix when you're using plugins and you start adding lots of plugins? He's noticing in a lot of his mixes, he adds plugin after plugin after plugin, and then before you know it, it just sounds worse than it did before. Watching your videos, sometimes tracks will have almost no processing, and sometimes they'll have tons. So, how do you reconcile that?
Well, I think the question sort of is the answer is if it's sounding worse with more and more plugins, just get rid of stuff. I think that when I end up with lots of plugins on a track, each one of them is doing a super specific job. Like, let's say there's an EQ3 to suck out mid-range that I don't like. So there's only one band, maybe two bands there. Then there's a lo-fi to clip it a little bit. Then there's a Shep 73 to do like musical EQ because I want to bring out the warmth or whatever you want to call it on something. Then maybe there's a compressor because it's an acoustic guitar and I love the sound of a compressor like an LA3A directly on an acoustic guitar. And then maybe there's a little mid-range boost after the compressor just to bring out some of the grit that's coming off the LA3. So that's what, 5 plugins, 6,
Mm-hmm.
whatever I said. And that's a ton for me, but each one of those is just doing a little tiny job, and none of those jobs are the same. I'm not using 3 compressors. I'm not using a slow and a fast. I'm just not good at that. There are people who do that. They'll double compress things and it works really well.
Yeah.
But yeah, I've just found that usually if you have to keep adding stuff to it, you might want to go back to the original sound and figure out exactly what it is you're trying to do. And you've got to do these things in context. And I think this is also part of the problem. We talked about it earlier, is
Mm-hmm.
don't try and make everything sound good. That's ridiculous. If, like, let's say it's a rock track, if the kick, the snare, cymbals to a point, but you just have to be able to hear them, rhythm guitars, and vocal, if those all sound really good, then it doesn't matter what anything else sounds like. You're just going to find a level and a pan for it, and you're done. And you might have to clean up some low end with a high pass or something like that. But you don't need to go in and EQ every single guitar. Don't do it. Get your balance up and do stuff in context, and then you won't use as much.
You guys, I hope you guys all heard what he just said because that's the truth. You don't have to overmix everything. You don't have to make everything perfect on its own because odds are, but the time you're done, it's gonna sound terrible. You're
And
better off
also,
just
nobody gets to hear the stuff on its own. So don't
correct.
worry about it. No one gets to solo up the bass, you
No,
know.
yeah. So Rudy was wondering, as plugins have gotten better and better, and the modeling inside of plugins has gotten better and better, do you notice the difference between, say the Bomb Factory 76 and the new UAD 1176s? Are you hearing the evolution in the quality of the plugins?
Um, I don't I don't know if I would say I hear it in terms of the quality, but they're just different. They're just really different. Like a track I'm actually working on right now came to me with Bomb Factory 1176s on the vocals, and they was split like verse and chorus vocal or something like that. And on one of the tracks, I swapped it out for a CLA 76, And on the other track, the Bomb Factory worked a lot better. So,
Yeah.
I mean, I guess you could argue that the CLA is closer to the hardware, but they all have the feel of an 1176, and that's just a compressor that I like and I know what it does. So, yeah, I mean, you can't actually say that they're better
Hmm.
because in this particular instance, on a lead vocal, the Bomb Factory killed the Waves one, and it killed the UAD one. There's no comparison. The Bomb Factory did exactly what needed to happen on this vocal, and the
Yeah.
other one sucked. So there's obviously an evolution, and what's cool is that I think that the modeling now is more component by component and less just overall system, which means they're starting to do the extreme settings better. Like the Bomb Factory, all buttons in, it's nothing. I mean, it just doesn't sound right. And it doesn't even sound right with the slowest attack, fastest release. It's not as fast as it should be. Whereas the newer models capture that side of the hardware better, the more extreme settings. But
Hmm.
for kind of middle of the road settings, they're just different flavors.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and you hit again another key of like, if it sounds good, it sounds good. It doesn't matter if it's $1,000 tool or a free plugin. Whatever works and sounds good is what's going to sound good in the end. It doesn't matter what the
Yeah,
price point is.
there's EQ3 and Lo-Fi all over all of my mixes, and they're free.
Yeah, just saying. So another specific question here from Nikos. He's wondering, do you have a quality, or he's running more specifically about sample rates and bit depths. So, do you hear and feel a difference between 2444 and say 96? And if so, how do you choose what sample rate you're going to use for a project?
Well, I only choose the sample rate if I'm recording. When I'm mixing, I mix it whatever sample rate things come in at. I definitely don't enjoy working at 44.1 as much. To be completely honest, at the moment, I don't hear a massive difference between 48 and 96 if it's got a reasonable number of tracks. I think when the track count starts getting crazy, you've got this weird trade-off of having a little bit more like math headroom is the way I think of it when you're mixing at 96 because the math is just a bit more accurate.
Hmm.
But at the same time, you're making everything work a lot harder, so things get sluggish and it's kind of a pain in the ass. So I'm fine with 4824 at this point. I think that a lot of the converters now sound really, really good, and recording at 48 is fine. But if I'm recording something where it's a fully live project and it's meant to sound like the instruments and it's all microphones in a good room in front of good instruments, I definitely still think that 96 sounds better. But you can absolutely work at 4824 and be fine. And I cannot think of a single reason why anybody should work at 44.1 instead of 48. It's ridiculous. There's no reason to. The files aren't that much bigger. Work at
Yeah,
48 and everything just sounds better.
yeah, I totally agree. So we have a question from Frank where he was looking for your philosophy about using effects sends specifically in either mono or stereo. How do you always use stereo or do you generally send things in mono?
Um, well, really, what you're asking is about the effects I use, whether they're stereo in or mono in, right? Because the
Correct.
sends themselves are whatever width the source track is, and my sends will always follow the main pan. So, technically they're always stereo because I've got stuff going to a stereo output.
Hmm.
Um, so in general, I love multi-mono things, even with reverb sometimes. So there's a left reverb and a right reverb, and that way, if I pan something all the way to the left, its reverb is only on the left.
Yeah.
That doesn't always work. Like vocal reverbs are generally stereo, so they're intermingling. But I like the separation only because it just helps keep the mix wide, and wide is always good. There's never a real benefit to not having good stereo imaging and separation. So the more kind of multi-mono or true stereo effects I can use, the better, because it just kind of keeps stuff where I'm panning. Because otherwise, what can happen is you're trying to pan something and it just sort of refuses to move because you've got a lot of effects on it, and it
Hmm.
just is coming back mono no matter what you do with it.
Yeah. And I mean, it's interesting. That's something I've never really done approached is the multi mono use of everything. I notice you use that on your rear bus compression. You use on your effects. Are there any places where you don't want that multi-mono, the extra stereo width?
Well, I mean, like vocal reverbs, maybe, because it could be weird if you get background vocals that aren't always a stereo pad, and then all of a sudden their reverb is only on one side. Like that can be distracting. Um, there's one of my parallel drum compressors that isn't multi-mono, but that's like by mistake. It
Yeah.
just it wasn't. It was linked, and I never caught it. And I tried changing it once, and it didn't sound better to me, so I've left it. I think I left it. I might have unlinked it now. Who
Is
knows?
that the
That
Fatso
template
one?
change. Yeah, but that template changes. I mean, there have been so many changes even since that video. It's constantly evolving. So that one might be multi-mono now. If I think about it, I always start with multi-mono, and then if it causes a problem, I get rid of it. Because obviously, anything that's distracting has to be fixed. Like it can't be distracting because now it's making you listen to the reverb and not to the song. So I'll fix stuff. But other than reverbs, I think I'm fine with multi-mono everywhere.
Nice. Well, so speaking of reverbs, tons of people are really interested in hearing from you. Especially Alan was asking, what's your favorite software reverb and why?
It's. I mean, I don't know that I could pick an absolute favorite, but I would say that Altiverb is something I've had forever since it first came out, and I've got some of my own IRs for it and things, so I've got a real soft spot for that because it's so versatile just to load that stuff up. I also love the Waves IR1, is that what it's called? Their convolution reverb, because it's got some controls for like decorrelating the stereo in it that aren't on other convolution reverbs. So that's got some really cool stuff. So for convolution stuff, I suppose that I like a lot of the sampled plates, whether they're in plugins as plates or whether they're IRs for this convolution stuff. But I also still love Deverb. It's in my template now. It's one of the vocal reverbs in my template. It's like made an appearance because it's just super easy to hear. It's kind of grainy. It's slightly chorused. It just sounds like reverb. It's like a good 80s reverb to me. So I don't know that I could pick a favorite, but those are probably the two that I use the most.
So, what would be your recommendation to everybody out there that is on a budget? Like, obviously, you can get any plugin that you want. But for the people out there who are just like building up their plugin collection, how do you pick and choose? How do you start identifying, do I go with Waves or UAD, or do I just use the built-in stuff for free? What would your advice be there?
I'm actually looking at my plugin folder now, which is a daunting task in and of itself, because all I ever do is buy plugins now. Every mix I get, there's some plugin in there that I don't know about, and I go get the demo and like, oh, that's cool, and then I buy it because that's like all I spend money on because I don't buy gear anymore. It's hard to say. I mean, I think when you're talking about Waves or UAD, you're talking about a platform, basically. UAD, you're talking about a hardware investment. So their stuff is amazing, but you have to buy hardware for it to run on. So that is an investment. And it also makes you less portable. I mean, I'm mixing on a laptop, but I always have to have UAD hardware with me. So I can't just work on a mix on a plane unless I've got a power outlet. So that's a consideration. If you're just between the two of them, I guess you could say that Waves gives you an advantage of just running natively. Mm-hmm. There are things that each of them has that the other one definitely doesn't have. But you can also just pick and choose from those two. I mean, if you're going to buy an audio interface that has chips in it, well, then the Apollos give you a way to run UAD, but also give you your I/O. So maybe that's a good place to go. But there are a lot of software companies, like if I was just going to say one company to just go pick up reverbs, Valhalla. Their reverbs are insane. They're awesome. The vintage verb, the plate, they're great. They're really, really great. And I think there are only 4 or 5 of them now, and the whole suite will be a few $100, and they're very different. There are lots of controls on them. And then also, whatever reverb you are using, make sure that you mess with filtering on the way in, pre-delays, filtering on the way out, de-essing on the way in, all that kind of stuff. And you can build little plugin chains that give you 3 times as many reverb presets as you would get just dealing with a reverb plugin.
Yeah, that's great. And the Valhalla stuff is amazing. Like, I've dove into those. Actually, I think it was your fault. When you were doing your video, I heard it. I was like, I I've heard of them. I've heard other people use them, but I hadn't used them myself. And it's between UAD reverbs for like rooms and more realistic sounds, or the plate, and then Valhalla for everything else.
Right.
So Jesper was asking, everyone knows, it's well documented that you've gone in the box and that you love being in the box for
Yep.
a whole host of reasons. But his question was, what do you appreciate about analog workflow and analog sound? Like, do you ever do any projects going back analog, and what do you get from doing that?
Well, I never mix analog, no, and I don't think I'd want to at this point, unless it was like an on-the-spot, like mixing live while it's being recorded. That would be great. I love recording on a console, and I love recording on my console at the studio in Wales where we've installed it. I mean, that's like going to Mono Valley and recording great microphones in an amazing sounding room, and with, that's the best thing ever. But that's not really an analog workflow. I mean, the only analog workflow that exists would be if you're working on tape, and that's something that on a really special project with like a punk band who loves to play live and isn't worried about fixing stuff, and I could see that would be a lot of fun. But I think in general, the analog workflow for recording is the same for everybody. I mean, if you happen to have a console in front of you, that's amazing, but if you just have 4 mic pre's built into your audio interface, you're doing the same thing. Yeah. It's all the same. You've got to get the microphone up to line level. You may process it on the way into the computer, and then it's going into the computer. And at that point, don't take it out. So, no, there's nothing about mixing on analog that would make me want to go do it, unless it, like I say, it was a really specific live thing.
Mm-hmm. Nice. What about, George was asking about for like the low end, kick and bass. How do you build those two things together and get them to work as one unit?
I don't really think about it. I mean, it's like the kick drum always gets attention because when I crank the speakers, the kick drum needs to do a certain thing, and that thing is different on every song, but it needs to do what it's doing. Bass, who knows? I mean, I've just put it up, and then it either works or it needs help. And so sometimes I distort it, sometimes I'll actually roll off low end, sometimes it is the low end of the kick drum. It just depends. It really depends on the song. And I think that if you're struggling with it, though, just let one of them lead in the low end and let the other kind of do whatever it does and see if that's enough low end in the mix. The other thing is to see, obviously, the kick drum is usually the rhythmic low end, but it isn't always the rhythmic low end. It might be a much sparser pattern than what the bass is doing, and the bass might have a lot of attack to it, in which case the bass is the rhythm of the low end. So in that case, maybe the kick drum shouldn't really have a huge amount of low end because it'll end up distracting you from the bass, and it'll be less consistent than letting the bass really like hammer around down there. So it's on a case-by-case basis. But again, if you don't spend too much time trying to make them both sound great, I think you're going to be fine. I spend a lot of time on the kick drum, and I usually spend almost no time on the bass. The bass is about balance, much more than it is about sound for me.
So you don't really sit there and kind of think, okay, the bass is going to be above the kick, or vice versa. You just kind of get the kick to sound good.
Yeah, there's never anything that specific with me. Well, ever, really.
You just kind of keep moving, right?
Yeah. If it's not sounding right, then you got to go deal with it. And if I feel like I've already dealt with the kick drum, because I dealt with it on its own right at the beginning of the mix process, because that is one of the first things I'll do on most songs is try and get the drums to like work as a unit. I'll usually mess with the bass because I feel like, well, I've already looked at the kick drum, it's probably fine. Or it'll be really obvious that I need to go back and take a look at the kick drum because it's causing the problem. I mean, you kind of take it for granted that one is okay. It'll be obvious if it isn't okay.
Yeah, that makes sense. So Todd was wondering, when you're finished with the mix, so you have your final mix and it's going to be going off to mastering, do you do any adjustments? Do you remove any of your stereo bus processing, or do you just send exactly what you've been sending?
No. Yeah, no. You've got to. I think it's, and a lot of people do this, so I'm not going to say it's wrong at all, but to me it's weird to have a mix that nobody has ever heard, and then to have the limited version or whatever it is that you've sent to the band, you've done notes, you've sent to the label, you've sent to the producer, that they've approved. And then some other mix that literally nobody, including you, has ever heard because you're mixing through the stuff most likely. and then that goes off to mastering, and then like they get back a different record. That doesn't make sense. Now, if you have a really good relationship with a mastering engineer, there are a lot of people who mix who don't put any EQ or compression on their mix bus, but presumably that's what they're sending out to be approved as well. Like, otherwise you're doing a mix bus, but then you're asking the mastering engineer to magically guess what you did just to get back to what everybody approved, and then take it even further. So no, I don't. And look, I'm weird, and it's not the prescribed method. This is not technically correct, but no, my mixes are loud and they're basically already mastered. But that's just the way I mix. So I'm not advocating for it, but that's what I do.
I was gonna say, and that's kind of the question here is like, if you're already basically maximizing and doing that peak limiting there, what does the mastering engineering do for you?
Usually very little. I mean, there are a couple of people that I work with a lot who really like my mixes, and so they'll hear across the scope of an album that certain mixes need to come up or down in level, or the low end isn't really consistent between these two songs, and so in the order that the album is going to be, they should really deal with that. And that's their job, is to take the individual mixes and turn it into an album as a whole. But I've had a lot of stuff where it's just a flat transfer. They're just doing all of the technical side of mastering without any of the audio side, and that's fine. Whatever. It's a good payday for them. I don't think they mind.
I was gonna say, you're making their lives easier, so they're not gonna complain.
Yeah.
So we had a question here asking about getting your mixes to translate to PA systems and discos and festivals. How do you do that? What's the secret to making a mix sound good in the studio and also on gigantic, thousands of watts?
Yeah, I mean, I can't really speak specifically to like PA systems because I don't ever, my stuff doesn't get played there unless it's being played before a gig or whatever. So I don't know. Like, once you get into like clubs where basically they're in mono with tons of subs, like, I don't know how you prepare for that. Maybe you got to take it to the club. I mean, and that's what, all the remixes used to do. They'd cut white label 12 inches and take them to the club and play it, and like, oh, that's no good. And they go back to the studio and tweak it. So that used to be how you do it. In terms of just having mixes translate in general, you just make the best sounding mix you can possibly make, and it will survive translating to other stuff. My stuff, when I make a mix that I think sounds super aggressive on the tannoys or on the headphones that I'm mixing on, I'm always pleasantly, not even surprised, but it's good when I hear it on laptop speakers or on somebody's phone or whatever, it does carry over. And this is going back to just having the one pair of speakers thing. You've got to have a pair of speakers you can trust, because if it's super exciting in your studio, but it isn't exciting elsewhere, then you need to change what you're listening to in your studio, period. But once you get that together, then, it will translate. It just does. If it's a good sounding mix, it will a good feeling mix. I don't even want to say good sounding, because not from like an audiophile standpoint, but just if it feels good, it will feel good everywhere. Because it's not relying on having some kick-ass sub. It's that the balance is awesome. So off you go.
Yeah. So Nanfer had a question here about analog summing. Have you experimented at all with analog summing? And if so, do you have some favorites?
Yeah, my favorite is none. It really, and it's documented elsewhere. I don't remember where I've spoken about, but I've spoken about this before. But basically, my idea about analog summing is I don't get any benefit from it. If all I'm doing is summing, to me, it doesn't sound as good. It sounds different, and I don't like it because it's not what I've been listening to. Now, if I were building a mix listening through analog summing, then I'm sure if I got rid of the analog summing, I wouldn't like it as much because you're changing it. There's nothing that analog summing does that I feel like I'm missing. Look, analog summing, if you go through a straight up passive summer, it's just 10K resistors. So that's it. So you're not getting the benefit of anything. What you're doing is you're going through a D to A and an A to D, which to me is detrimental. So for lots of reasons, I don't want to go into it too much, but you don't need analog summing. It might work great for you, in which case you should absolutely use it. I'm not saying don't use it, but don't think that you're just one analog summing box away from having everything finally come together. You don't have to have it. If you have an active summing box, what it's doing is it's adding harmonic distortion, and if it has transformers, it's adding a high pass and a low pass filter that are way out in the frequency range, but that's what it's doing. You can mimic that stuff with plugins, and it'll actually change your mix. If you do a high pass at 20 hertz and a low pass at like 18.5 or even 22 or something like that, it will affect the way stuff feels in a mix. And you can do it on individual elements, you can do it on the whole mix. And then you can put some sort of clipper. You can put, any of the tape emulation or the analog emulation stuff and dial that into taste, like the Phoenix plugins or whatever. Mm-hmm. And you are now doing what analog summing does. What you're not going to get is if you happen to love the sound of certain D to A's and A to D's, well, that's part of going through analog summing. So you've just got to listen to it and make a decision. But there is nothing inherently better about using analog summing than not using it.
Yeah. That's awesome to hear, because everyone has different opinions on this, but I tend to agree with you of like any sound that you want you can get in the box. Going out of the box to summing is just adding an extra step.
And the biggest test for me is when I was moving from the console into the box. Mm-hmm. For a while I was using a console, so a Neve 8068 was just analog summing. I had faders at 0, no EQ, no sends, just hard panning and faders at 0. And that did not sound any better to me than just keeping it in the box if I started the mix in the box.
Yeah. So you've experimented, you've heard the difference, and you're like, I'm going
oh yeah, I listened and if it didn't sound as good to me, I would still be using my Neve as the summing box. Because I'd have to, because I wouldn't feel like I was getting what I needed to get.
Totally. So David had a question here about references and working with clients. So how do you tackle a mix from an artist if they have no vision and no reference, and they're just like, here, Andrew, do whatever you want with my mix? How do you deal with that kind of situation?
Well, there's always some vision. I mean, it's got to be there in the track somewhere. And they've done a rough mix, which hopefully has some thing that will guide you into how they want their song to feel. And that's always, I mean, like when I do get references, they're often very confusing because musically it might not be anything like what they actually want. But I try to figure out, well, what is it about that reference that they do want? So I will generally just use the rough mix as their reference. That is the reference. That's where they're saying, like, hey, this is what we think the balance is, what we think is important, and how we think the song goes.
Yeah, that makes sense. And
your video froze to me, which I don't care about, but am I okay coming that way?
Yep, you're still coming through great.
Okay, cool.
Let me pick another question here. Let's, real quickly, what's your favorite maximizer? L2, L3? Which one's your favorite?
Just for straight up limiting, I still use the L2 all the time. I think it sounds really good. The L3 is cool, but it's got something soft about it sometimes. I don't know. It's hard to explain. And it's like for the processing overhead, it doesn't sound better enough to me to bother with. Like the L2 is great. Really simple and really clean.
And Jim was asking, we've talked a lot about balance, between kick and bass. Now he's wondering, when it comes to the whole instrumental mix and the vocal, how do you develop the taste to know a vocal is in the right place and not too loud or too soft in a mix?
Just from doing it. I mean, I don't advocate listening to lots of different speakers for me, but it definitely works for other people. But you need perspective. So for me, I'll listen super loud and I'll listen super quiet. And I'll take a break and come back and listen. And it's just obvious if the vocal is sticking out. And sometimes I miss it. Sometimes the vocal's like 5 dB too loud and I don't get it. And the first mix comment is like, hey, why is the vocal so loud? Like, okay, I mean, it's possible to miss it because you're so into the vocal that it's like, wow, who cares that I can't hear the guitars? But generally, if you change your perspective by either taking a break or listening on different speakers or in mono with a speaker facing away from you or at a totally different level or something like that, you will get an idea of where the vocal needs to sit.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then we're going to wrap this up here really soon. So everybody that's watching, make sure you stick around because we're going to cut to some exclusive excerpts out of Andrew's Green Day mixing tutorial that you're not going to want to miss. And if you enjoy those, you're obviously going to want to go over to our site and also watch the full tutorial where we have Andrew mixing Green Day, Ziggy Marley, Zach Brown Band, and also another one of the most popular videos we've ever had is Andrew's mixing template, where you actually took the time to break down the entire template, plugin by plugin, every routing, and then giving that away to download, which is incredible. And so many people are adapting parts of Andrew's system and kind of using it in their mixes, and the feedback on that has just been absolutely incredible, man.
Awesome. And probably in at least one of those videos, I'm wearing this shirt. So it'll be familiar to you. It'll be nice.
Exactly. You'll recognize same Andrew. So before we wrap it up, a great question I think here to end on is from Billy, where he's asking sorry, I lost his question here. What's something that everybody believes when it comes to mixing that you think is total BS?
Well, we've already covered some of it. I mean, I think that and not everybody believes this, but I think it's very easy to think that you're one plugin or one piece of gear away from your mixes finally being what you want them to be. And that's definitely not true. I could absolutely mix with just stock Pro Tools plugins. I wouldn't enjoy it as much because I've set up all these tools that do things that are fun, but I could do it. And as much as I would rather use all the tools that I do use, I don't feel like I couldn't get rid of any of them. And that was a lesson that I learned the hard way by moving from the console into the box. I felt like I'll never work again, but I have to try and do this, and it's going to be really difficult. And it turns out that, and look, people can argue that they think that all the stuff I mix on the console sounds better than everything I've done since, but there were some discussions when I was kind of making the transition. And of course, the thing is, people are trying to figure out what got mixed on the console and what didn't during the transition, but things don't come out in the same order that I mixed them. So there was stuff coming out that was on the console after stuff that I'd mixed in the box. And there are people saying, oh, come on, listen to that. That's so obviously in the box. It sounds terrible. That mix is great. It's analog. And then it's like, well, no, that one was in the box and that was fully analog. And that one was some combination of the two. Yeah. So you need a certain set of tools to get work done. But like, I do a ton of work in these headphones because I happen to have them and it's a controlled listening environment. And my speakers are set up in a different building up the road. And, I don't always want to go. So you can get a lot of work done on very, very minimal equipment. You've just got to trust that if the mix doesn't sound right to you, you need to keep working on it. But it's much more important that it feels great and is about the song and you don't worry about individual elements. And when you really start embracing that, you won't worry so much about the specific tools. And I really do think that again, it's not something that everybody thinks, but I think people sort of lust after things, and it's an endless lust for stuff, thinking that that's what will finally make it all happen. And it's not the case.
It's not where it comes from, right? It comes from experience and doing it and practice and learning what tools you have rather than pining after the next piece of expensive gear.
Yeah, well, but it just gives you an excuse. Like, your mix isn't great and it's not great. And you're like, yeah, but that's because I don't have this thing. Like, well, but no, but look, if you're lucky enough that people who aren't in the music business hear the mix you did, they don't even know what that thing is you're talking about, and they don't care. So it only matters what comes out of the speakers, and that's it. So don't let those things stop you from making something that you'd be proud to have other people listen to. You can't have to explain the mix before you hit play. Like, oh, this would have been better, but it was recorded badly. Or, it doesn't matter. You have to hit play and go, it's great.
So I have a question here. Have you always been this confident with your mixes and your mixing process, or has this been a evolution to where you are today?
No, look, I still, if I'm coming across as confident, that's amazing, because I am still so insecure. I mean, I sent a mix this morning that I've been working on, and it's the first song for an artist I hadn't worked for before. And I was deathly afraid that I completely screwed it up. I mean, I just expected pages and pages and pages of notes or just to get fired. Like, that's absolutely the way I feel on most mixes. There are a couple of mixes I've done over the last couple of years. I'm like, oh man, that sounds amazing. I don't know what happened, but like that really came together. The transition to the chorus is incredible. And on one of those, I actually got fired. Like, they didn't like it. And so I'm off doing something else. So it's, yeah, I don't know about the confidence thing. I think it's that I have gotten to the point, though, where when there is a problem with the arrangement or something like that, where I know that it's my job to overcome it, but if a round of comments comes back pointing out the thing that I think I already know, I'm confident enough to say, okay, I agree with you, and I think that the way to fix it is you need to go off and do some percussion, or whatever it is. Like this, the background vocal arrangement is really weird, and it's stepping on the lead. Like whatever it is, I'm confident enough to say I think this is why the mix isn't working yet. But I won't even say it on the first pass because I've spent all of my time trying to make it work as is. So sometimes you do actually make it work as is, and sometimes you're just not hearing it right. Like you think it's supposed to do one thing and it's supposed to do another. But yeah, I don't know that I'm confident at all. I think what I'm confident in is that when I'm ready to send a mix, I've made it as good as I think I can before needing to get some feedback, instead of just kind of giving up.
Makes sense. So, sorry, I have to address one question that's been coming on a lot from the live chat here, which is on the topic of A, what headphones are you using? And then B, do you ever use any like room or headphone correction plugins?
I'm using Sony MDR 7506s. They're their standard thing, and I use them because I've owned them for years, forever. I mean, and I bought 6 pairs when I was tracking a lot at my studio in LA because they're bright, they're comfortable, drummers can hear a click track, like singers like them. So I'm just used to them, and I think they probably match up with the Tannoy as well because they're bright. And I never use any of the modeling stuff. I've tried it, and it's amazing what it does, but the correction stuff is just massive amounts of EQ, and I hear that. I don't like it. I'd rather just let whatever is coming out come out. And like, you're not trying to acoustically fix anything, so it's not like tuning a room where you've got weird standing waves. There are no standing waves in headphones, so yeah. I don't think you really need that at all. If you don't like the way your headphones sound, you just got to find a different pair of headphones, or possibly a different headphone amp. Don't tune headphones that you don't like. Like, that's ridiculous. I use these just flat. I use the UAD Twin because it's sitting on the desktop and has a nice big knob, so ergonomically it's fun to work with. That's my headphone amp most of the time when I'm on headphones. And the head tracking stuff, like the Waves NX, the technology is so amazing. It's insanely cool, but it's doing something I don't want. Like, I hate the fact that when I'm mixing on speakers and I turn my head, I'm no longer in the middle. I love the fact that I can go like this and I'm still in the middle, and then I can go like this and I'm still in the middle, and I do that. My posture is terrible, but I'm still between the speakers. Like, I can change my listening position without changing the listening position, and I love that. I've got a studio strapped to my head when I'm in headphones, so I don't want it to change. But I also have a pair of Tannoys in a room that sounds good enough, and it's a living room. That's all it is. It's just a dead room that doesn't sound like much, so I can hear my speakers. So I have speakers that I can trust, so that's fine. I'm not trying to make up for having no acoustic listening environment. So maybe it is good if you're only going to use headphones. But at this point, I'll do mixes on headphones and then go put it up on the speakers and like, okay, great. I don't need to change anything. So I don't think you desperately need that stuff. And personally, I just want to hear the headphones. The same way with my speakers, I just want to hear the speakers. I got an analog amplifier, no EQ, and it's in a dead room, so it doesn't need to be acoustically treated.
Yeah. And do you ever find, like, in terms of panning and, stereo image, like, if you just learned to love the headphone, like, complete discrete left and right panning?
Yeah, and it's actually been good for me because when I mixed on the console only, I was almost always using discrete panning, left, right, or center, because the pan pot, you actually had to switch it in, and it changed the level, so your balance changed. And so I didn't really use it. You had a button for left and a button for right, and you push them both in, and it's in the middle. But also, I use usually there's some mix widening on my bus. So what that does is, even if something is hard left, there's still a little bit of it out of phase in the right. So it doesn't do that weird, like, pulling thing when you've got an acoustic guitar on one side by itself for a bit. And so the stereo widening will take care of that. But yeah, I absolutely trust the stereo field that I get in headphones. And, a lot of people will listen in headphones. So if something is annoying in the headphones, I better fix it. So it's not a bad thing to actually be checking out.
Awesome. So we're kind of coming up here on time. So Andrew, is there anything that you want to share with the Puremix community that we haven't touched on today?
No.
No, you've said everything. Go watch the videos.
I think so. No, I mean, I think so. I don't know. I think I've said it. It was like the big answer I just gave. I think you've got the most important phrase for any mixer is all that matters is what comes out of the speakers, and you've got to believe that. So that means you're not allowed to make excuses for yourself. You're also not allowed to fool yourself into thinking something's okay when it isn't. The biggest thing is, though, you just need to own what's coming out of the speakers and not be saying, like, well, it's not a great recording. I mix a lot of stuff that is not recorded that well, and it doesn't matter. It might mean that we're not going to end up with the most audiophile mix, but I don't care about that. I just want things to feel good. There's always a way to make stuff feel good. And if you want an example of that, listen to some early Stones records. There are some that are famously taken off of little cassette demos because they never got the feel as good. So they they tried to recut the song and they didn't use it. Those don't sound good, but who cares? It doesn't matter. It's what feels great. And like some of the Dylan stuff is crazy squash, but that's what makes it feel so amazing. And so, yeah, it's only about what you're hearing when you hit play. And that's all anybody cares about. So, yeah, I suppose if I had to sum it all up, that's it.
Just do what feels good.
Yeah.
Very cool. Well, Andrew, thank you so much for spending all this time with us today and answering. I mean, we got through a ton of questions. It's always fascinating talking with you and hearing, just your insights and experience and everything that goes into mixing and making records. Like, thank you so much for sharing all of this with our community.
Well, thanks, Ben. Thanks for being an awesome host, as always.
Thank you very much. So everybody that's watching, got three things for you, actually. One is I'm going to show you some exclusive excerpts from Andrew's Green Day mixing tutorial, so make sure you stick around for those. Number two, we have a summer sale going on right now, so you can get 40% off of Pro memberships, which gives you access to all of Andrew's videos, all of Fab's, Mark Needham, just every video that's on the site.
And Mick Gazowski, don't forget Mick.
Oh man, Mick's videos. Have you watched them, Andrew?
Yes, of course. I watch everybody's videos. Are you kidding me? That's why my template keeps changing. I see what other people are doing. Like, oh my God, I got to do that.
Well, you should see the Fab's template videos coming out very, very soon, and it's similar but different. It's good. I'm interested to hear what you think about it, Andrew.
Yeah, I can't wait.
So make sure you guys sign up for a Pro membership. If you're enjoying stuff like this, we have mixing contests. We have Pro member only Q&As that are a little bit smaller, a little bit more intimate. And then the other key thing here is I'm going to share a survey link in the live chat. If you guys have enjoyed what you're watching today, I would love to hear some feedback from you. And lastly, if you
haven't enjoyed it, tell us that too.
Yeah. Or just email Andrew. I don't want to hear about it.
Yeah, okay, that's fair enough.
And lastly, if you enjoyed this, share it. We're going to leave this interview up, and we want to share this knowledge with as many people as possible. So if you guys have enjoyed what you saw today, share the webpage, YouTube link, don't care. Just share this interview and spread this knowledge with all of your friends, and I'm sure they'll appreciate it just as much as you have. Any parting words, Andrew?
No, you already did that. I can't come up with anything else.
Great. Well, then let's cut to some Green Day.
Next on our list is bass. Very straight ahead, there is a DI and then 2 different amps, an SVT and a bassman, and obviously Mike's a great bass player and Chris is a great recording engineer, so there's not a lot going on here. They were being collected into a mono output on the session they sent me, so I'm collecting into a mono aux. There's a decapitator for a little bit of color. Then there is a fatso. And this is because I got a session to mix once and someone had put a fatso on the bass and it sounded really cool and I just saved their settings. I don't even remember who it was. It sounded cool, so every once in a while when I'm not sure what I want to do with the bass, I'll just pull that up. And then there's an EQ, which is something I use quite often on bass and guitars. It's a Helios model, and UAD has one, Waves has one. I've been using the Waves one lately. And adding either 700 or 1K on the bass is just the presence, as well as using the 60 hertz circuit of the Helios. In this particular mix, I'm actually adding 1 dB of it. Normally, that can just sit at 0. As soon as you switch it in, there's resonance, and it's just because of the way the filter circuit is built. You have some sort of feedback in the crossover. I don't know exactly what the topology is, but it will resonate at around the frequency that it's set to. So this can add a lot of really cool low end to the bass. So I'm going to play you the bass tracks individually with everything still on, and then we'll go through what I'm doing overall. Here's a DI. Just adding a bunch of presence to that. And that's not because I think that it sounds better with that. What it is I'm using that DI track to get the sort of intimate part of the bass sound, which is the sound of the strings themselves, as opposed to the thundering bass tone that is the rest of it. Then here's the first of the amps. And here's the bassman. A little bit dirtier, and obviously added together, those 2 amps are just going to fill out the low end because the low end is going to be completely in phase, but the mid-range will be a little bit different. So we're going to get more low end, a little more solid. It will also even out. This particular bass track is pretty even note to note, but just having 2 recordings of it will even it out because the notes that are quiet, unless it's the bass itself, aren't going to be the same amount quiet in every amplifier or every microphone. Adding the DI back into that, you start to get more definition. And that definition sort of acts like aggression. The more you can hear the attack of the note, the more aggressive the bass will sound. Sometimes, especially while recording, there are people I've seen who feel as though the more distorted something gets, the bigger and more aggressive it will sound. And the reality is, the more distorted something gets, the less attack it will have, and it can quite often get less aggressive. And especially in the track, you start to lose all of the rhythmic element, which is where the energy and aggression will come from something like that. So it's actually sort of a cleaner bass than you might expect on this track, but it will pick up distortion from the guitars in a way. So it's much more important that you can hear exactly what it's doing, and it's the driving pick on the strings that's making it happen. Now that we've got all 3 tracks in, I will show you what's going on with these overall plugins. So the decapitator. Pretty subtle, just a little bit of drive on there. That is then followed by the fatso. It actually has the feel of parallel compression to me. So it's bringing the low mids to the forefront and it's really evening everything out. And then, last but not least, the EQ. What's interesting to me about this, and it's why I love this particular EQ, but just EQ in general, To me, this makes the biggest difference to the bass sound. It obviously sounds very different with the Fatso, but the Fatso is just making it a bit more of what it already is. This little bit of EQ at 700 hertz and then the resonance at 60 is turning it into a really exciting bass sound as opposed to just a really good bass sound of an exciting performance. So check that out again. There you go. EQ is much more than just frequency shaping. It can really change the character of stuff, and that happens on the toms. It can happen on anything really, but I think it's really apparent there. And then this is getting sent off to the rear bus. Next were the toms, and again, to avoid having playback errors while I was working on this song, because it's at 96K, there were a lot of tracks, a lot of plugins going on at one point. I've frozen these tracks, all they had on them were gates. There's nothing super exciting about that. Toms are going to a stereo aux, which I will now unmute, and let's solo up the toms. Really well recorded. They get used a couple of times for fills. In those spots, they need to be very, very loud. And what they had been doing was they had a studio reverb, which I took off. One of the few times I actually got rid of some of their processing. They used the CLA drums plugin, which worked really well. Well, it adds quite a bit of the tone. And I would normally do this with something like Pultec, things like that. And I think I may have actually rerouted back into my Pultec. So this is something that they had used. It's almost scooping them out, which is actually kind of cool. This feeds into this idea of stadium drums. This is much more like toms through a PA as opposed to a natural sounding close mic. I think it's what really makes the drums work on this song in a really interesting way. After that, a little bit of EQ to bring out some attack. Then they had actually added a bit of 100 just to get some more low end. So it's all about this low resonance ringing. But what's great about the way the toms are tuned is it's actually very controlled. There's a beautiful decay to this low end as opposed to it just ringing, which can happen especially in a drum pattern like this. The length of the toms is really cool, and the EQ is what's really helping make that length. From there, the toms are being routed into the tom track from my template, which is adding yet more 100 hertz, just with a different Pultec model, and some 5K. It's really just taking the sound of the toms that they had gotten and going further with it. What this L2 does is it allows me to make the toms louder in the balance of the kit without there being these huge spikes that are then going off to the drum compressors. Because I don't want the toms to necessarily obliterate the rest of the kit, but they need to be loud and they've got to cut through the cymbals. So this L2 just sort of keeps them in check while also giving me a place where I can just crank this threshold slider around and get more level out of them without having to just turn them up. It's just a different way to do it. And then I am sending them off to my tom reverb. And so I got rid of their studio verb in place of my reverb, sort of doing the same job, but this is again kind of a stadium reverb. So without the reverb, it's a little bit of that grainy, almost nonlinear ambience, and I'm getting that out of an ambience preset on Revibe. And I'm filtering on the way in case there's some cymbal bleed, and I'm doing a bit of pitch shifting on the way out, and that's what gives it that sort of PA stadium thing as opposed to just a nonlinear reverb. Use this on almost every rock track that I do to varying degrees. It'll be very quiet on a quieter track because I don't want you to hear the pitch shifting, I just want you to get the sense of size. And when we get to the breakdown of the song over here where the toms are really busy, That reverb makes a huge difference in the feel of the kit. Instead of you feeling like you're sort of sitting next to the drummer, you feel like you're in an arena with the drummer, which on this song was absolutely the point.